Hello there, folks, and welcome back once again to Southbank Live, our weekly YouTube broadcast where we take a deep dive into what's going on in the markets over the past week and try to figure out what's going on beneath the surface. Now, this evening, we have a very special guest. We've got David Murrin, who I interviewed a few weeks back over at the Southbank headquarters, and who will be today answering a few questions from the audience and indeed debating some of the more recent news, as the world is, of course, moving at a very rapid pace. Good evening, David. How are you getting on at the minute?
I'm very well, thanks, Boaz. Looking forward to a new form of communication with you. The last two have been fabulous, so let's see how it cracks on a day which I think is really significant, because I think the equity markets in the US are finally cracking
Indeed.
in a big way. So I think today's an interesting day to be here.
Well, it's good. We've got our timing pretty well. Of course, timing is everything in markets, and we shall, of course, be. This is a recording as well. So, folks who couldn't join us this evening, you, of course, will be able to get a recording of this. Or if you have to dash away in the middle, it's all right. You can return back to this. But a very good evening to everybody who has joined us here on YouTube or LinkedIn or Facebook or anything like that. Hello to HK, Barry, and Andrew, and Robin and John. A lot of people in the chat already, which is great. Just to kick things off, David, you are an acclaimed geopolitical and historical forecaster. You're very good at taking these models of the past and applying them to human behavior and then making predictions based on that. Perhaps you could give our viewers this evening a brief intro to yourself and your very adventurous career, which has spanned all manner of different sectors.
Look, yeah, you can read all about my career on the website. Essentially, it starts off as a physicist, geophysicist, ended up in Papua New Guinea as a seismologist, exposed to the tribes people and watched the first collective behavioral patterns. Just completely changed my perspective on who humanity really is. But of course, they were not like us, because that was looking back in the past. Ended up, strange enough, years later, sitting on a floor in JP Morgan, joining one of their programs, which is brilliant, actually, and thinking what I know about finance. And as a good scientist does, you watch everyone else. And suddenly I realized that we, modern man, are no different from Papua New Guineans. We're collective, maybe higher thresholds of individuality, but there on the trading floor was collective human behavior. I became fascinated by that, full stop, and especially the concept of predicting future price moves as a directional trader. I became one of the first successful prop traders in the bank, and very quickly built a whole organization which predicted markets based on price, way ahead of its time, changed the whole bank's risk profile. What do you do with that? You set up a hedge fund. That's what I did in the early 90s, way before people could spell hedge fund. CIO of my own hedge fund all the way up until I stopped managing money in 2013, when I realized they're just going to print more money than I wanted to fight. And there was another time to come back. And in between that, after 9/11, I had this fundamental realization that what if that America was the last of the Western Christian worlds or systems, and we were going into a terminal phase of decline. So I started to reverse engineer price models into behavioral patterns, built the 5 stages of empire, and that model I started to apply to understand where every country was on the curve. By 2002, I'd been able to predict that America had entered decline, the 5th stage. China was in the rise, and they were part of super systems behind them, and the time ahead of us was going to be pretty tumultuous. At the same time, we'd recognized the K-wave cycle of 56 years split by 2. That's sort of 23 years that started in 2000, would peak around 25, not far from where we are now, would bring about a commodity surge, which is a key investment thesis. And we got the whole move from 00 to 10, and essentially bring about World War III, or the risk of World War III, as China challenged America. And we're talking about 20 years ago, very accurate timing, very bold kind of construct, but it was very clear to me. And then Breaking the Code of History, published in 2009, which was the essential thesis I developed 7 years before. As a dyslexic, it was probably my life's greatest achievement to be able to write a book. And funny enough, it was brought about when I had my second and third children, who were twins. And the night I sat there feeding them, thinking, what sort of world have we brought them into? I better write this book to warn people of where we were going and how we repeat our patterns. And that's the efficacy of Breaking the Code of History. And it's frighteningly been accurate. I wish I could say it was a load of crap, because life would be a lot happier, but it's proven to be remarkably accurate. And we're now living out what I call the decade of catastrophe of consciousness, whether humanity survives this clash of hegemonic power with weapons that are so powerful to destroy us, is really the big issue in front of us. and all the things we're seeing in the marketplace with large printing of money, that cycle coming to an end, the Chinese challenging Russia, they're all linked to the things I predicted, which led me to start Global Forecaster in 2019. And my conclusion was really simple: setting up another hedge fund and making lots of money for me wasn't really going to help anyone, especially my children and our children. And as soon as you manage money, you can't tell people why you do what you do and when you do. So I created Global Forecaster, which doesn't manage money. It lets people tap in and pay for the IP because it's relatively cheap for them. But most importantly, I wanted to cascade the ideas into lateral people that would then start to affect change and change the course of this rather terrible path ahead of us. And that's exactly what we've been dedicated to in the past 2 years. Alpha generation has been off the charts, as has the success of our geopolitical predictions.
I was first introduced to your ideas through your book, Breaking the Code of History, which I would thoroughly recommend to all our viewers. It's a big one, but it's definitely worth the read, and it covers all manner of different aspects of human history and political structures, market structures, demographics, things like that. It's a great read. But David, looking more closely, you say you also wrote the other book, Red Lightning: How China Won World War III, and how the West lost World War III to China in 2025. I guess it depends on which way you look at it, right? For how China won World War III, or how the West lost World War III. But could you walk us through a little bit about that? Because I think for the purpose of this conversation, it's something I'd like to dig into a little bit further, because of course we are very close now to 2025, and we are seeing this stirring where conflict in Europe is now accepted pretty much. This is something that nobody thought was possible for a very long period of time, and yet has now reared its head, and it has changed the way people look at markets and commodities. What's your thoughts on what is going on with Russia and Ukraine at the minute? Because while we did have a conversation about this a few weeks back, the conversation with the situation is fluid, to borrow a Dick Cheney line.
Obviously, I had in the back of my mind this commodity cycle that was going to lead to conflict. So defense is actually one of my fascinations, and of course, only in 9/11 could I start to equate how it might look and relate to the other outside world. And I was really, could see the rise of China and, whole conduit they were in would lead to a massive arms race. And the arrogance and hubris of the West in ignoring that just staggered me as it went along. They were so desperate to grab the money that was on offer, they became blinded by the threat. And I talked about this covert manipulation of our society to encourage us to build their manufacturing base that they would then put back against us in an arms race we couldn't match. And lo and behold, we're in that situation. In 2015, when the defense review came out, I was tearing my hair out. So I wrote my first defense review for the UK, which talked about what we should have done. And I got it out there, and some people listened, but, just carried on. Where's the threat? Where's the danger? And as we came into 2020, at the time of the pandemic, which I'd also predicted in my book, it would come from a Chinese weapons laboratory and it would be an asymmetric threat. So I was very alert to it. All my clients knew about it on the 5th of January. How it took the government 3 months to work it out is beyond me, or 6 weeks, 10 weeks is really incompetence and collective linear thinking, in my opinion. But essentially, sorry, I'll just get your phone for you.
No problem.
Or my phone. So I decided to mount a real campaign to explain to people, and I wrote a defense review called Now or Never, and people laughed at the time and said, why are you bothering? Because it's all about the pandemic. And so you don't understand the pandemic is also part of the chain of the disablement to the West, in my opinion. It's timing the strategic advantage it's given the Chinese. We should increasingly be alert. And I got this piece out. I got it into number 10. I got into the Ministry of Defense and the Treasury. And 3 weeks later, Boris made his statement about defense really mattered. And he took all the words out of Now or Never. I was thinking, wow, did that really work? Of course, the defense review itself was disastrous, cloaked in little increases in changes. We literally watched our capacity be destroyed in the third disastrous defense review, to the point we couldn't defend ourselves. And there's a good reason why Putin is aggressive. Is because Britain, as one of the key European states, is failing to show and have failed to show the intention to defend itself. weapon systems like ASW systems let Russian submarines creep right up to our coast. They could never do that in the Cold War. Imagine those signals pouring through Putin's information packs. It was just another thing that made us look weak. Our army was, disintegrated to brigade-size actions. So in desperation, and I'd had already been approached by various services to advise them, and I had been doing that in my capacity, the ones that wanted to affect change. I thought, how can I explain to people that we are going to lose if we do this? And the simple mechanism is that everything that we see with Putin and China comes because US carrier dominance has been threatened by hypersonic weapons. Now, I watched these develop years ago. I warned people about them. Now we know the word, but most people don't understand. They're designed to kill carriers, because if you kill carriers, American power dissipates. And red lightning is all about how America loses, and Britain, all its carriers, barring one, in the first 20 minutes of an all-out strike of 10,000 missiles with hypersonic warheads. And then the second part of it is the technology we could employ to make our carriers invulnerable to such attacks. And it's a wake-up call to just not accepting this asymmetric challenge and change of balance. And it's got all sorts of responses from people. I think after Russia, people take it far more seriously. I was, as you know, I was predicting that the whole war in Russia based on the commodity cycle's revenues into Putin's hands and his mindset back in November, when giving it a 98% probability it would take place, and it did. So I wish, to be honest, I was making predictions that all turned wrong. I feel much happier. I'm rather alarmed that the rate of predictions and the quality of predictions is so high that we should all be very alarmed. And you ask what you can do: spread the word, act as a secondary node, like talk about it, be alarmed about it, spread the cascade. And remember the story that in 1936, in March, after the Germans invaded the Rhinelands, it was the people that demanded that fighter command was developed to protect against the bomber, against the air ministry and the government. And fighter command came about through popular opinion. And we all know it saved the day in the Battle of Britain and gave us the chance to do the cat, to survive and go to the next phase.
It's really, really interesting. Again, there's so many avenues we could go down with that. Maybe just quickly, David, when you're talking about what World War III, or what the threat of World War III is, ultimately, who are the various parties involved here? Is China working alone? Is it in cahoots with Russia? Which side is India on? Is it Britain and the US? Is it NATO? Who is
okay,
who?
So the main protagonist in this process is Russia's hegemonic challenge of America. Without China, sorry, not Russia, China. Without China, none of this would happen, because no one can match the scale of the hegemon at the moment, or the past hegemon about to be the past hegemon. So China's key to that. And then you have Russia with a different agenda, which is now strategically allied to China. Make no mistake, the announcement before the Olympics was a strategic military alliance. They both, the Chinese knew about what was going to happen in Ukraine, and they backed off, but they knew about that process. And then you've also got North Korea, which is a satellite of China. It can't afford itself, yet it can afford a large army designed to move south into South Korea. So you can tick the box, that's under Chinese control, and you know what it's there for. It's there at the same time as a challenge to Taiwan. You can assume that South Korea is invaded too. And then you've got Iran, who is ever closer to Russia and China. And you've got to assume that their nuclear breakout will take place at the same time. So that's your force structure. The Indians are very much terrified of the Chinese, even if they have a strategic past relationship with the Russians. And you can assume the Indians actually are with the Japanese, Australian, US, and UK contingent that surrounds China.
Right. Now, in terms of why China would want to escalate to the level of taking out carrier strike groups with hypersonic missiles, what would be the driver here? Number one, what do you hope to achieve, and why would you want to escalate to a kinetic conflict in order to achieve it?
So the thing you've got to remember is that sea power and sea hegemony is how you control the world. Britain controlled the world through its navy and battleships. America controlled the world through its carriers, and the Chinese seek to replicate the same hegemonic process. They plan to do it by removing the primary threat, which is carrier capabilities. And that thread goes back to the third Taiwan Straits crisis in 1996, when the Americans sailed 2 carriers and a Mu group, which is a small assault carrier, through, and it shut down any aspiration for the Chinese to expand kinetically, overtly, as they had been doing gradually, slowly since the end of their civil war. And that's when they switched to a covert strategy of getting us to invest in a larger manufacturing base so they could match a more overt strategy of an equal sized navy, which they've been building.
Right. But what would be the cause for an all out assault on all
Okay,
of
so, so,
America's
so
capital?
what is the cause? What was the cause for an all-out assault on Ukraine? It was the point that the aggressor, who's a predator, decided that the timing was right for him. So, what are the constituents? The commodity cycle had given him sufficient wealth to feel like he could afford it over time and reconstitute his strategic rocket forces so that his nuclear umbrella worked and there was a threat of it. Most importantly, he saw that Biden was weak, and there must have been a rush for the door between Xi and Putin to go first, because losing Biden because he dies of old age in office is the worst thing that can happen to them. And after the rout from Afghanistan, that was a red flag to a bull for an aggressor. So those things happen. So why didn't the Chinese move at the same time the Russians moved? Well, it's a really interesting thing in martial arts I'll never forget. And that's when 2 people fight 1 person. No one ever does it simultaneously. The first goes in and the other watches to see what's happening. And that's sort of where China is. It's watching. It's learning from the petri dish of combat. And the Russians are adapting to the combat zone. And you'll see their skill set increase. They're at the bottom of the cycle, but they will increase and are. And the Chinese are drawing every lesson out of it to work out what they didn't know, what they need to know, and how basically to cope with it.
And now the Chinese are getting an awful lot of very, very cheap energy as a result of this. If we move to markets as sort of the consequences of this, when you're looking at the market generally, if you're looking at commodities, and you've said you're very bearish on equities at the minute, what's your current take on it? Do you think markets are actually reasonably pricing in the consequences of what
So
you're
let's
predicting?
just, I think there's an important string here. The big thing is that the doomsday bubble, as I call it, which is the product of printing money, started in '01 all the way through the '08 crisis through to the COVID crisis, essentially is about the 5th stage of US empire compensating for lack of productivity by printing money and creating leverage. That has reached astronomical levels, as befits a hegemonic power threatened by a more productive challenger, China. And finally, it's completely run out of steam. So we are looking at equity collapse on a scale of 29 squared. That's where we're going. And the fact that Chinese managed to squeeze an enormous, but through the pandemic, force America to print those last vestiges of money, tipped everything over the balance. And that money could have far better been used, for example, in the process of creating more defense spending to reduce the imbalances of power that are growing. Now they've all been spent. So strategically, it was brilliant. That was its goal, in my opinion. Asymmetric economic warfare to destroy the debt structure so that West couldn't fund itself against an oncoming challenge. Works brilliantly. So we're very close to that collapse. It's going to be very ugly. It's going to be very quick. And at the moment, I think the commodity cycle that we all see essentially is one that has completed its first surge. So everyone's bullish on commodities. They all think they're going up and wars make them happen. But actually, I would take the opinion that we're about to have a massive demand slap. So commodities are very vulnerable to a deep retracement before they continue their next surge.
What is the cause of the demand slap there?
It's just quite simply when equities fall out of bed, which they are about to do, essentially people's personal wealth disappears. In America, most of it's in equities. Imagine equities drop 50%, how poor America is going to feel.
Right, and that just leads to a knock-on in
It
demand
does.
across the board.
Yeah,
Right.
exactly right.
How long do you think it would take before commodities would start rising again after that?
Well, I think this is going to be the most enormous slap. I mean, horrendous slap. But nonetheless, I think that if you look at the kind of the next step is China makes its move. So if you disable America and the West financially, they won't resist. So you collapse, and then the Chinese make their move on Taiwan, and then you get more demand. Now demand has collapsed, but now suddenly you can't get commodities because the Chinese, the whole dynamic between where they're sourced, and then you start the next cycle, which is the third wave, and that turns out to be huge. And now you just increase input inflation and stagflation. And that's where we are. We're in massive stagflation. And I can see that CPI, if CPI reached 15% at the height of the K cycle in 75, you rest assured it'll be 3 times to 4 times higher at the height of 25. So rampant, crazy superinflation is very much, after this collapse, you need to brace yourself for the next chapter. It's not one chapter and, oh shit, that hurt, but I survived. It's like the double whammy. And that's exactly what happens to systems that are old. They get entropic shocks in different degrees, whether it's hegemonic challenge, it's inflation, whether it's, debt cycles that collapse. They all happen at once and the system is swamped. And we still haven't really been hit by the magnitude of those swamping waves just yet.
Lead me through the threat facing the equity market. So we're looking specifically at different sectors of it, or just completely broad across the board?
I think the thing that really fascinating was that the rally that led to that massive extension in price, which is the doomsday bubble, was very narrow. Read any textbook, and broad is healthy, narrow is very unhealthy. So all you need is, as we've seen with stocks like Meta and soon to be Amazon suffers because everyone's about to get poorer because we've got a cost of living crisis on steroids. It's only going to get worse. So anything that has a consumer element of choice is going to just suffer. And then you get the price comes down. Now the price comes down and then the whole system collapses because they'll lead, 5-6 stocks will lead the NASDAQ through the floor. And that's the cascade we're in right now.
What do you think that looked like for the FTSE here in Blighty?
So the FTSE's been really strong. It's been really strong because predominantly it has full of commodities. So everyone thinks it's a good bet. The trouble is, in the cycle I've just described, the commodities take a massive dive and the FTSE just catches up with everyone else.
So is the safe haven just in gold and precious metals, or is there?
At the moment it is, and at the moment it's more gold and silver. I mean, one of the things that we're going to find out what happens with gold and silver is that essentially whenever stocks have dropped out of bed, the first response is gold gets sold off and then it recovers. I suspect this time it won't, but you always have to be prepared to be caught with your paddy pants down. So just, be mindful of it. If it holds its price, which I think it is, I think there's a good chance it's already made a significant low in the past week. If that holds and that behavior changes, which I think it well might, then gold is your best safe haven.
Now, we do have plenty of comments and questions here in the chat. I think we'll take a small adventure through some of these questions before we get back to some of the other themes we can explore this evening. This one's from
I love
Robin.
the one. It's 7 p.m. Why have I missed anything?
Robin asked, hello, Boaz. Can you ask David Murrin where the best place is to hide out during World War III, please?
Is it
time to get a boat?
Well, I think boats, as a sailor, I've thought about this. I think the use of nuclear weapons at sea against submarines and targets is probably more prolific and would happen before it happened on land. So the idea of bimbling up and down in your boat and being whacked by some, large wall of water doesn't really appeal to me. So I put that one in the bin. In terms of places, I think northern Canada is well and truly within the Western sphere of influence, and it's wild enough up there that you're not going to be a direct target. And that's probably my favorite place, to be honest. If you want to go to New Zealand, you'll be captured first by the Chinese. You run through the list, and it's a world war. And if it's a nuclear war, it goes everywhere. So that being said, one of the things I think is very interesting is that if you go and look at the warhead ratios of Russia, and you look at them when they were first in the Cold War, there was America and there was Europe, and there were a set number of warheads which would have dealt a deadly blow. But you've got India, you've got China, because the deal in a nuclear exchange is you don't just go for the enemy, as in America for Russia and Russia for America. They take out everyone at the same time, so no one can stand tall and will be immune while they go through hell. So actually, the distribution of warheads currently from the ICBM warhead loads is actually, I would say, much lower and more thinly distributed than it was in the Cold War for its target set. Now, that leaves an interesting question that there may well be large holes in that. So I don't see this assumption that a nuclear war is unsurvivable. Obviously, depends if you're in London, you're probably not going to make it. But some of the gaps between where these blasts come make it a very different proposition. Now you suffer from fallout and all sorts of other dynamics, but remember there are civil defense protocols, and if you want to be inspired, go to Finland. Those guys have done a brilliant job for 6 million people. They can all go underground. They built bunkers. And I've always argued that any smart country should have always done what Finland did, as long as a single nuclear weapon is available for someone to drop on your head. And of course, we've forgotten that because we thought history had changed. And in our liberal delusions, here we are.
Yeah, the Finns do seem to have things figured out. Though at the same time, half of the reason for that is just because they're so close to Russia. And I wonder with
What it
what
is, what's very interesting about them is they're so close that their real threat was a conventional assault.
yeah.
Right? Not a nuclear threat, really, because they just get run over first. Now they built a relatively large army, but that's not the first front line. I think it's what is really interesting. They took the responsibility to protect their people, and they gave them the best protection. Now, I would argue that from the time that Johnson got into office, one of his greatest failings is the attendance to defend the realm. It's been compounded because he's done the right thing, I would argue, by helping Ukraine. I think he's linked his own political survival to the survival of Ukraine quite rightly, because that's the only thing that stands between him and being kicked out. But in the process of resisting Russia and leading the charge for NATO, he has refused to spend more money on defense. And Sunak is in the way, and that's completely unacceptable. We should be spending £200 million right now, immediately, and be on 5 to 8%, because right now we've just prodded the bear and we are the number one target. I do not understand how the electorate can accept that, or that any leader considers themselves a leader when they increase the risk parameters without mitigation.
How close do you think we are to a nuclear exchange?
Okay, so exchange nuclear, let's talk about this. So a full-on mutually assured destruction, like eradicate each other, I still think all the barriers are there. No one wins. The Chinese would be very pissed off if the Russians triggered that, because the Chinese believe they can inherit the world, and they consider Russia to be an impediment to doing that from a radioactive dust cloud. So believe me, the Chinese don't want it because they see a route to success and hegemony with a non-nuclear avenue. The West don't want it, and Putin doesn't want it, I'm convinced. But what they did do is they created a strategy called de-escalation, which I commented on when it was published in 2019, which was, okay, we've got these lovely weak Western leaders, and intention is everything. The evidence is overwhelming that success in the Falklands meant that Margaret Thatcher was perceived to be the Iron Lady, and in an invasion of Europe, she would use nuclear weapons if necessary, and the concept that West was weak and fall, and you push them over with an invasion, fell apart because of her intention manifest in the success in the Falklands War. Now, it's the converse. When Putin looks at Biden, man, it's the opposite. When he looks at the Western powers of Germany, it's the opposite. He looks at France, well, he whispers in his ear and that's not going to work. And he looks at one country and it's Boris. Well, that's not really impressive either, although he's more impressive than the rest. So essentially, he created this mechanism whereby I drop a small nuclear weapon on the battlefield, maybe 500 tons, 1,000 tons, make it an airburst, no fallout, and I demonstrate I'll go higher and I scare the shit out of them. That's what we're living with right now. And we don't have a strategy to compensate. And if he does that in Ukraine, it falls outside our envelope. And there is only one way you can do that and say, we will consider Ukraine to be part of NATO if nuclear weapons are used. Suddenly that's different, no grey zone. But we haven't thought like that. Instead, what he did was code the Western leaders to act like Pavlov's dogs and basically say, we can't start World War III, we can't escalate it. And it created the outcome he wanted, which was a bubble in which he could conventionally rape and pillage Ukraine untouched. And then the response by the West is keep slithering weapons in below a threshold of response and hope we can keep Ukraine alive. I don't think that's acceptable, because even if Ukraine stops right now, Putin has the upper hand. Everywhere he goes, he can use the same de-escalation policy to intimidate any country he wants. So our security paradigm is irrevocably fractured unless we face him and face off against this de-escalation policy by manifesting intention. And the simple concept of that, if you've ever all seen a bully, is essentially being nice to a bully begats more aggression. Putting your toe next to him, giving him the biggest thump in the face and decking him is the fastest way to address the power balance. We have to do that with Putin because fundamentally he's a bully and a street fighter.
What do you think is the likelihood of that occurring? It is a very interesting idea to say Ukraine is part of NATO if it suffers a nuclear attack. But how do you think there is a likelihood that NATO would do that?
The main commander of NATO, as in Biden, is I call him an invertebrate, and I'm not being rude. there is no courage or spine or understanding of the concept of deterrence and intention and peace, just acquiescence and appeasement. Look at France, and I'm afraid Macron isn't going to do it because I think they named him the Putin Whisperer for a reason. Putin got inside his head. And Britain is the other country, and we don't have enough strategic lateral leadership to get ahead of the curve. One of the speeches I gave recently to a group of generals was essentially the mode of a peacetime armed force is linear, because linear people like structure, they like predictability, they're very good politically, and in peacetime you end up with linear leadership. And in wartime, given enough time, it adapts to lateral leadership, because lateral people think ahead, strategically find how to go around the back door, and the lateral people are actually the warrior race within the subset within humanity. So the problem we've got is we've got a lateral leader in the form of Boris without any personal discipline and strategic construct, advised by the majority of linear people who are constantly behind Putin's actions. Everyone thinks we're ahead. Oh, let's go and have an economic war with Putin. We'll beat him. No, you won't. As I described at the time, let's take a knife to a gunfight and let's go and try and beat an economy that's based on commodities in an upward commodity cycle, an inflationary cycle where they naturally don't suffer from that because they sell at a higher price. And we're a consumer society. We should have learned. In the peak of that cycle in 75, we almost lost the Cold War. History's repeating itself. So you need lateral people to get ahead of the challenge. Set the goals up so you are ahead at all times. And the first thing we need is full lateralization of our leadership, because that's the first thing that creates different outcomes.
On the strategy of Putin to escalate in order to de-escalate, and the use of tactical nuclear weapons, small nuclear weapons, from my understanding, I don't believe any of the NATO countries have tactical nuclear weapons in any size. So if Putin were to try and do it, there wouldn't be much you could retaliate with.
They do. The French have more. America has tons of them. And Britain doesn't. And if you noted in the last strategic defense review, there's a specific note to develop and they increase the number of warheads from 180 to about 220, and specifically small tactical nuclear weapons because they realized what was missing.
And those could be deployed then in the event that...
Yeah, I mean, they're essentially the smallest nuclear weapon you can make uses 7 kilograms of enriched uranium and yields about 500 tons. It's a suitcase bomb, and you stick them in a warhead or an artillery shell. And if you put them in as an airburst, they don't suck up all the earth and make it radioactive. They create a low overpressure, which is a big thump, which is a little bit like the Lebanese explosion. So it's much more about the word nuclear than it is about the definitive impact.
Right.
Now, obviously, you can scale their use, their yields, their sizes, but that's one of the things that people kind of fail to understand. Nuclear weapons have a whole load of different yield properties, and you can use them in different ways with different outcomes. We just didn't have them, and Britain didn't. America still does, and Putin decided to use that gap as his strategic lever to create the bubble to start intimidating everyone conventionally.
We do get a comment here from Rune, who asks, when we're talking about equity crashes, how about stocks and funds linked to South America and Africa? Can they hold up better?
No. If you look at the emerging market world, it's actually been leading the fall. So if you look at the MSCI, it made its peak last year somewhere around February, March. It had the same fifth wave extension dynamic as the NASDAQ and literally led the fall. And if you want to kind of see what the NASDAQ will look like, have a look at the MSCI. And now, in terms of Africa, big fan of Africa, but Chinese money's everywhere. Look at South Africa. CCP are completely into bought the ANC, and essentially what they really want is control of the Cape trade route. Now Britain's smart. We need to really battle to get the Western Cape to sever itself in this economic trauma that South Africa's going through, so we can get hold of the Cape trade route again. All the geostrategic concepts are back. I love Africa, and I think as long as the US Navy can protect Africa from the force of a Chinese Navy having a migration and prosecuting a debt issue, it could be safe. But I do think it's a battleground that has to be cleared of Chinese and Russian influence. And I think it would be in the case of a global war. But, again, you'll suffer the same downdraft as everywhere else.
And this is from Jamie, who asks, how would Mexico likely be affected by a nuclear war?
Well, that's going back to it has a trade relationship with America, which is obviously be constrained somewhat as its economy went to the size of a sixpence, and at the same time, probably its industrial bases wouldn't be allowed to survive either because it would just substitute, and so everyone gets dragged into this. If you are targeting your nuclear weapons for a full exchange, no one is allowed to survive it. So that's how they thought in the Cold War, and I'm sure they still think.
This is a comment from John, who asks when Theresa May was Prime Minister. She said one day in the Commons, "Mr. Putin, we know what you are up to." Any idea on what she meant? Was it cyber or was it Ukraine?
You know what? I have to say she's one of the great disappointments in prime ministerial office, and I think actually she holds a lot of responsibility for the path towards Ukraine. So one of the things that Putin wanted to do was dismantle the Cold War relationship between weapons of mass destruction, essentially between the group is nuclear, chemical, and biological. And the rule in the Cold War was use any one of them and we'll use one of them back, as in use a chemical, biological weapon, you'll get a nuclear weapon on your head. And there's no doubt in my mind that he went about severing that linkage, whether it was in Syria and the chemical red line, and subsequently in Salisbury, because he was looking for the way we responded to what is an escalation of a wartime intent. And May was absolutely pathetic, along with Sedwell. I mean, really, they have huge responsibility. What they probably did was turn the lights out somewhere in some eastern Russian city with a cyber attack, and thought that scared Putin. For the magnitude of what he did versus we did, it was a come on of mega degree. And I remember hearing about an exercise where essentially that particular generation of leadership was telling us that we didn't need kinetic weapons. Strange, the Chinese were building kinetic weapons, the Russians were, and the Americans, but they decided that we didn't need kinetic weapons anymore. So essentially in their exercises, they got to the point of turning the lights out in Moscow, and they turned around and said to the PM, so you can either nuke them or surrender, because there's nothing in between. Which is exactly the problem. No escalation scale, no adaptability in your response curve. Honestly, from Cameron onwards, I actually think they're responsible for this war in Ukraine and what comes next by leaving us so exposed.
On the topic of what's going on in China at the minute, David, where they've got in Shanghai, for example, where they've got very, very strict COVID restrictions, and there's a threat of full lockdown in Beijing. For an outside observer, it seems very, very strange that they're still going really hardcore on COVID. And when I've spoken to Chinese folks about this, well, they've said, well, we dealt with SARS really well by going after a really hardline policy here. But I still don't think I have a full grasp of what they're doing and why. Could you maybe enlighten me?
Well, look, this is obviously my theory as it is. So there's a 72-page document you can all download on my website. It's about the origins of the pandemic. I believe it came from a Chinese weapons laboratory. It was asymmetrically designed to create economic impediment in the West. And they had a mechanism. They actually had an antidote, which they sprayed in the streets, a freeze-dried version without a furin cleavage. So for the first wave of the pandemic, they didn't really suffer from it. But what they have suffered from is basically they haven't adapted that. They've got mutations that have flooded in from the outside that we went through in a fairly traditional multi-wave pandemic. We've had 3 clear waves which suffered consequences, although I'd still say not enough for lockdowns. We're into our 4th and 5th, whereas they've got a whole population which had some inoculation to the first and the other ones they haven't. And they're also very dogmatic. So this idea that you face a problem with force and organization is very Chinese. There's 1.2 billion of them. It's cultural, and they don't move and they don't change. So I think they've been locked into that strategy. And what do you do if you're the Communist Party? You just turn up the volume and you keep doing it and you keep doing it. But it's ironic that if my thesis is right, they released it upon the world, then essentially that it's now boomerang back. And that's the problem of having an RNA virus. It's like multiple, it adapts and it keeps changing. And you've got a huge pool of people in China who are not immune to the subsequent adaptations, hence their responses.
It certainly would make a lot of sense. And it's a fascinating theory, David. Are there any aspects of that you'd like to expand on?
No, I think I said it all, really.
They certainly covered all the bases, but it has such weight. If that it would be real to be true, it certainly would make a lot of things that happened over the past couple of years look pretty strange in retrospect. When we're thinking of the consequences of COVID, everyone seems to have conveniently forgotten about it, and they're just all angry about Ukraine or American politics or something else. Everyone's sort of looking for the next crisis. But the cost of COVID, with the huge amount of debt, huge amount of government spending, that's not going anywhere. What do you think the consequences of that are going to be as we head into this next
As
crisis?
I mentioned, I think its purpose was asymmetric economic disablement, and that's what we've just really had. We have put our debt through the roof. So even if you survive the crash, how do you fund a proper arms race with defence? You won't be able to, and that's its main role. So I think it's done its job. We're asleep. We still have this really cool window where, honestly, I do think we could go out there and borrow. If I was in the UK government, I'd borrow a phenomenal amount of money, like 1,000 billion, and I'd use it to fund my defence for the next 3 years because I know my interest rate's 2%. I'd pay 3% for it, knowing inflation is so high. Right now, they should be doing massive long fundings because that's the only thing that's we're going to have a revenue drop. It's just a nightmare scenario of entropic waves altogether.
It's a pretty pessimistic discussion, I've got to say, David. Though, of course, you're not saying this just for fun.
Look, I'm trying to say it to wake us up because we still have some choices left, but we're about to be put in a box where there are no choices. Our economy's imploded. We're stuck in stagflation. We barely hold our society together, and the Chinese and Russians continue with their moves. I mean, that's the options. So it's not to scare people, it's to wake them up. Now, one of my theories as to why everyone is so asleep is really simple. Bubbles create masses of dopamine. Bubbles and the stability and decline of systems create linear thinkers. So we've got linear leadership all over the place, from corporations to politicians, and everyone is saturated with the residuals of dopamine. The moment the stock market jumps off a cliff, believe me, the dopamine will replace with cortisol, and we will see the world completely differently. We will suddenly see the multitude of threats we face, and there will be conversations of why the hell didn't we do something? My job as a global forecaster, and what I set the organization up to do, was to warn people when you still had choices in your responses. That's what it's about.
What makes you think that the equity market is really on the precipice now, and it's not in, say, a year's time?
Look, all my work is based on price model analysis. They're very powerful. I mean, as you know from the tool, at 15,000, I made a call that the NASDAQ peak would be 67.20. And it turned out to be 67.40. And all of the guys that follow my work got to sell it at 67 in maximum size. So my work has precision timing. And right now, the things that we have are every down move is impulsive and every up move is corrective. And essentially, look at what happened with the Fed yesterday. They managed to talk, it managed to rally, and it spat the dummy. And now we're looking really bad today. And those are exactly the conditions that lead to truly vault-face collapses. Once the NASDAQ stays below 13,000, you're into a different door where all the bulls who tried to buy the dips are starting to have major indigestion. And then suddenly they'll all want to get out together.
It does seem like we are going through quite a regime shift when it comes to people's perceptions, especially when it comes to things like inflation. On the topic of commodities earlier, you mentioned how you think that the first wave of this commodity surge is reaching its end, or we've kind of gone past it. Is there a similar element there with inflation, as so much of inflation is as a result?
I wish it was so simple. So if we were in the past K cycle, it would be yes. Right? Because it was really K-cycle inflation is normally just linked to inputs. But there's two other real inflationary drivers that we face right now. The first is the supply chain. When we exported all our manufacturing to China, we suppressed inflation when we should have seen indigenous inflation from 2000 onwards. And now we're about to get it all back in our face. That is like a monster nightmare where suddenly we've got to find new supply as this Cold War brings an end to any kind of business relationship with China. Massive in its own right. And then the third one is all that printing of money. Looked good for a time, but it's like the dam broke And now the dam's broken. That alone is enough to swamp the system. So when you look at input inflation abates, the other forms of inflation are not going to abate. So no, there's going to be no reprieve at all.
Suddenly, it does feel like a good environment for gold in that situation. You mentioned there on the ending of trade ties totally with China. How soon on the horizon do you see that happening?
So I think we can assume that the Chinese are covertly doing what they can to support the Russians because they're not and cannot afford to see Russia fail. And that will involve chip substitutions for their weapons, drones. There will be covert support right now. Some stage the Americans are going to go, look what you've done. And then that's it. Sanctions for China, sanctions for Russia, one and the same thing escalates.
Right.
That's one scenario. The other is the Chinese decide to make their move in the land of, what do I do next? They make their move and they go for Taiwan. And, so if we see a stock market crash, I think that creates massive vulnerabilities.
And that would be the opportunity that would be seized.
Yes, exactly.
Did you think that China could just take Taiwan very rapidly, or would it be a drawn-out affair?
Well, I've got a scenario for that, to be honest, which I think is quite interesting. So whatever they do, we can assume that it's going to be done quietly and it's going to be a surprise. So one of the things that we've seen in Ukraine is the use of drones. And I think drones are an essential part of the Chinese plan. So we know that the Russians and Chinese put rockets and missiles onto container ships, which can, you can imagine a Chinese container ship 12 miles from Taiwan, surprise strike. Add on to that multitude of drones, which take everything out quickly. I think surprise is going to be a pretty critical stage in this equation.
And do you think that would be successful? Do you think the Taiwanese would be able to have any kind of air defense against that kind of thing?
Look, how do you defend against a multitude of small targets? We don't really have the defensive capabilities anywhere in our systems to do that. That's what swarms and small drones present. And I think we're going to see more and more about it. Imagine you're suddenly hit by, 20 switchblades all at once. Well, there are no systems around from different directions to save you. So I think drone saturation is a big revolution in military affairs. We're going to see an awful lot more of.
Yeah, certainly something folks are going to get used to, rather than just seeing it every now and then on a sci-fi movie.
Yeah, exactly.
We do get a question here from Rune, who says, a sociologist friend of mine says the situation today is closer to the years before 1914 than 1939. It suggests a more confused situation. What do you think, David?
I think that's a very perceptive comment, actually, because the primary, first of all, the Kondratiev cycle peaked in 14, so you're at the same part of the K cycle. And secondly, you've got Germany that actually didn't have to go to war, but chose to go to war as to where it was in its timing as a weaponized system. And it went to war to challenge the hegemony of Britain through France first. So actually very similar, very, very similar. There are some fascinating overlays, I would add, that do come about if you go and add in the Second World War. For example, the algorithmic expansion of Hitler, whether it was Czechoslovakia and more to Poland and then, to France, and you add these. So you can see Putin trying to replicate that as an algorithmic process. So that's interesting. And obviously, the interesting about the Second World War is it was the clash of the Western Christian world and also the Super Asian world. And so there are elements there that need to be infused. But in terms of sentiment within the American system, I think it's a very perceptive comment. And if you go and look at Britain, and I've written a lot about it, there was a revolution in government for almost 2 years, basically, where we had two governments and to the point of almost a military dictatorship because the leadership was so weak. And that encouraged the Kaiser to move further in his generals. Now that's Biden's regime. And then we also had a move to socialism at the same time. So the economic conditions of Britain and America are remarkably similar. I've written a lot about it.
Oh, very good question indeed. And we do have one from Jay here, which I find which is very, very good one, actually. Jay says, I've got a possibly dumb question. Don't worry, Jay. I'm full of those too. How would the market...
Boaz, I love the people who say I've got a possibly dumb question because normally they're quite smart. It's the one of the things I've got a smart question, which are usually quite dumb. So I like that prefix.
Perfect. Well, how would the markets react to nuclear war? I don't think it's a dumb question at all, Jay. I think it's a very good one. What do you think, David?
That is a very, I mean, a hell of a bloody difficult question. Obviously, with great apprehension. I heard some interesting comments that basically said, and I've forgotten what it was. It was like, you buy the shit out of it, and if it doesn't work, you're all dead anyway. Well, I mean, I have to say, it's a little short-sighted.
There's a certain logic to it. I can appreciate.
Yeah. There is. Look, I think right now we're on this precipice, and that precipice really is quite challenging. And uncertainty when people are ultra long never does anyone any good whatsoever. So I think it would end up with a massive price flush, but we're going to get there before that, so I wouldn't worry about it.
Right. Still, a good exercise, perhaps, to think about what might occur in that kind of situation. What do you think if we move away from nuclear escalation and we did look at China taking Taiwan or attempting to take Taiwan, David? How do you think markets would react to that?
Well, they go down. I mean, can you see a reason why they would buy? I mean, that's definitely not a dumb question, is it?
No. Well, I don't know. Maybe when it comes to semiconductors, for example, if China established a monopoly there.
Look, I think the issues around semiconductors and South Korea is included in that is really serious. It's a resource. And I've argued that wars are about resources.
Yeah.
So we need to take it very, very seriously that Taiwan is not just, a first stepping stone for China. It's also a resource basin for high-tech chips that we need. And therefore, again, the mistake that we sort of constantly seem to make, and it does really annoy me, is we could have declared a protective zone around Ukraine before the war happened, and we've still got a strategic ambivalence to support Taiwan or not. So much so that the Japanese have a strategy to say, well, we'll support them, knowing it'll drag the Americans in. Strategic ambivalence was very, very, at the heart of why the Germans thought they could invade France, because Britain and Lloyd George said we won't do anything about it. And the only reason we did is they went through Belgium. If they'd gone directly into France, we would have sat there and watched. So strategic ambivalence is a liberal doctrine of appeasement, and it always begats the worst outcome of conflict.
Certainly something which, I don't feel there's a clear answer from many Western leaders at all on what would happen in the event of Taiwan being invaded. I think it's an open question whether or not the American public would support another foreign war. They would equate it to the misadventures in Iraq and Afghanistan.
I think this is very different.
It's completely different, yeah.
Because Afghanistan and Iraq were existentialized peripheral conflicts that never could have made a difference. The thing that really could make a difference is China's ambitions anywhere, or Russia in Europe, and America understands that. So I think there is and especially if you've had a stock market crash, believe me, that kind of dynamic creates a very acute and aware concern over what comes next.
Right. We do get a good question here from Cindy, who asks, what will happen to the UK property market and when? Which is an interesting question given what we've discussed so far.
I think the horrible truth about this crash that's pending is everything will go down together. People, even with low interest rates, have big mortgages because the natural tendency is to leverage yourself for as much as you can afford. And so then suddenly you lose your job, or you're demanding to do it somewhere else, and the net effect is you can't afford to pay it. There's a default. So I think we're going to see an awful lot of very dangerous stuff around that.
Yeah, it does sound like there's nowhere to hide. And on that, we get a question from Suffolk Gardner, who asks, will gold miner shares fall as the rest of the market falls? If so,
I think gold and gold miners are kind of my sort of favorite zone. So, I would say net, they'll be the place to be. And yes, you may get a downdraft in gold and you may get a downdraft in them, but net, if you want to come out of it within a couple of years, to me, that's the only place to be.
Yeah. Is there any other safe havens out there, David, other than precious metals that you can think of?
No, I really can't, actually. Genuinely can't.
Oil? Is there any, or is that still something?
I mean, right now I think oil's has every chance of dropping to 70 to 60. So it depends where you own it, right? Right now being in cash is cool because you avoid the shit. That's really important. And then if you're smart, you can buy Bitcoin at 15, which I think is somewhere down there. You can buy some oil when it's back at 60, 70. But it's a question of timing. It's not just where you put it, it's when you put it. And you asked me the question, where is a safe haven now? It's gold, in
Right.
my best estimation.
A question from John regarding inflation and happier times. Alarm broke out when inflation reached 3 to 6% recently. Today, Radio 4 Bank of England quote suggests that 10% here and globally may soon occur. Any guess when 2% will be with us again?
Yeah, somewhere in 2030s.
Right. Well, we've got that to look forward to. That's the
So much
pulse of
fun,
now.
so much fun ahead.
Yeah. Well, speaking of fun, on the lighter-hearted section of Southbank Live, we do normally have our long-short segment where we take a look at markets over the past week and give something that we're bullish on, something that we're bearish on. This is not financial advice. It's purely just to have a bit of fun, really, and to shoot the breeze when it comes to markets. Given we have been speaking about some pretty grave topics here, like the annihilation of life as we know it, maybe we could look at the long and the short, David.
Well, my short's going to be in the stock markets in the US because that's where it is. And my long's going to be gold. So really simple. And if I was being more frivolous about it, I think you need to be long of all the great things in life that you enjoy. You need to be short of all the negative, like erroneous people and events around you that detract from the quality of life, and enjoy this period every day, every minute.
I think that's certainly, I think that's a great quote for us to take away from this, given the importance of the situation that we're now in, John. Sorry, David. David, like when you're thinking of things that people should bear in mind when it comes to this situation at the minute. We have covered a lot of angles here that you don't see covered in the press, a lot of angles here that mainstream investors aren't speaking about. Are there any other elements here that you think are being undiscussed that are very important?
Look, we've covered the new age of war and the road to wars and the need to spend massive amounts on defense. We've covered the cost of living crisis, which implies developing resilience for your economy in every sourcing of whether it's food, energy, all of those things, but by smarter solutions than we've got. And we've covered this implication that the stock market is about to tube and what it does to people, which is pretty difficult. So I think we've covered most of the hot topics at the moment. I do think the last topic I would drum home is if you are a linear leader and you look in the mirror and you are a linear thinker, well, you don't have to shoot yourself. You just have to somehow invite and encourage the lateral aspects of your organization to come right to the side around you and listen to them. And much of what they say to you will feel difficult, will feel hard to hear, but it's exactly what you need if you wish to preserve your organization in these entropic periods. That includes governments, that includes organizations, and it includes personal family units too.
One request from AJ. David's books again, please. As we are reaching the end of our hour, I think it would be very good for folks who are not familiar with your work, David. Tell them a bit about your books because they are great. I thoroughly endorse them, but introduce them in your own words.
So that's very kind of you, Boaz. So Breaking the Code of History, there's only a few, literally less than 100 so books left of the initial
Rare
edition.
commodities.
Yeah, and basically it's rare. So you can only buy them from my website. So, if you're interested, move quickly. That will give you all of the groundwork and knowledge which I've tried to share. And it has huge efficacy because you can see the predictions have turned out to be right. So, I'm not just someone pontificating. Obviously, I've got systematic approaches. They work. And I've been open in sharing them with you to empower you all to make better decisions, understand, and cascade that knowledge down to everyone else. So Lions Led by Lions, I never really advertised, but it's really started to take off in military circles. Is a story of the First World War and the real story of how Britain absolutely trashed the Germans by the end of it. And it wasn't Lions Led by Donkeys, but Lions Led by Lions. And the parallels embedded in it between the Chinese and German challenge and Britain and America as a hegemon, and the fact that lateral people ultimately evolved the BEF to beat Germany. One of them was Haig, interesting enough. I think Haig was probably more linear, but he let the lateral people run with it, and that made the difference. And then there's obviously, I do urge you to read Now or Never, because it's a template of what we have to do. You need to probably add like 150% what we really need to do, but it'll give you and let you be educated about defense, because everyone should be, and that's men and women. One of the things I really think is crazy is that women don't have a voice in defense because they're not interested. They're 51% of our population, or 50%, and they really need to get to speed. And red lightning, it'll take you 1 hour, and by the end of it, you'll be ringing up your MP and saying you need to do something.
Yeah. And of course, David, you write your Murrinations as well, which is much more fast-paced, as it were. I mean, you've got regular updates going out. Do you want to tell our viewers about that?
On the website, you will see all my theories are available to you. You can look at any Murrination over 10 years, which goes back 3 months. And if you want the updates, you pay £50 a month, and they come out, as and when. They're designed to be predictive and explain to you why I make those predictions. So they're educational, they're powerful, and they give you the construct you need to understand, kind of what's going on.
Well, there you have it, folks. I believe there is a link to David Murrin's website in the description for this video. It has been a great chat, and it's been very lively in the live chat as well. Thanks to everybody who has tuned in. This has been a very, very stimulating conversation, as ever, with you, David. Any closing moments, closing comments, before we end it?
There's a comment on the chat saying, when will the Age of Wars be out? I've been so busy. I mean, I've half done it, and I'm desperate to get it out. I gave a speech at the Defence College about it to all the one-star generals. It's in my head. It's mostly in. So I will get it out as soon as possible, because it'll explain to people how we got into this mess.
Well, hopefully we'll have another conversation around that time, David. I wish you all the best with completing it. And I think we'll call it there for this episode of Southbank Live. Hope you have enjoyed it. To everybody who has tuned in this evening, it's been great to host this live as ever. And if you are watching a recording of this, do give us a like and subscribe if you enjoy the content. That's all from us for the moment, but we'll see you in the next one. Bye-bye.